Thank you again, everyone, for coming today. Our speakers today are Scott Nelson, who is employed by Neami National and has spent the past 5 years developing and implementing the intensive mental health outreach support service at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre. He has been employed in various roles in the community mental health sector for the past 12 years, with a recent focus on supporting people who come into contact with the criminal justice system. He is joined by Mathew Cocomazzo, who is a psychologist currently employed at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre, where for the last 7 years, he has occupied the dual role of team leader of client services and drug and alcohol clinician. Mathew is also currently acting manager of the client services team. He has spent the last 20 years working in public and private settings, working with people presenting with addiction and mental health concerns. Welcome, Mathew and Scott. I will hand over to you now.
Beautiful. Thanks very much for the intro. So the presentation that Mathew and I have for you today we'll cover a few topics. So we'll speak a little bit about community justice and we'll speak a bit about how that looks at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre. And our focus in particular will be on the client services team where Mathew and I both work. And we have an extended case study that we're going to share with you today, which will hopefully illustrate how the model works in action on the ground. So our three key themes that we hope you take away from the presentation today is, in a nutshell, talking about alternative approaches to justice. So a community justice model being one of those that we have at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre, and that there are many benefits of this approach, not just for clients, but for the justice system more broadly and for the community. And I think that's really key here in terms of the community justice approach, is positioning the community at the centre. We're also, through the case study that we're going to share, you'll get a sense of the importance of collaboration. So we're going to talk about an integrated service model, so the client services team operating on what they call an embedded specialist services model. And really, we're going to hopefully demonstrate the importance of collaboration when we're working with people with multiple and complex support needs. So as the video might have already kind of alluded to, we're sort of talking about a few things here and a community justice approach. So we're kind of starting big here and then working our way down. So the Neighbourhood Justice Centre, as we've said, is an example of that community justice model. And our client services team sits within the Neighbourhood Justice Centre. So we'll take you through the client services team in a little bit more detail. So as you can see here from our slide, we've got a whole range of services that are located at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre that form this team. So we have predominantly services that are contracted, external services that already exist within the city of Yarra, which is our catchment and where we work. So these services are contracted to provide a staff member that's based at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre as their primary place of work. And they form the team in addition to a number of the team leader, a manager and career justice worker that are employed directly by the court, but the vast majority are all external services. So we have support available to anyone in the city of Yarra. So not just for people coming into court, although by and large, that's the majority of people that we'd be working with, that be coming in for a court matter. But the support is available to anybody within our catchment. So people can walk in off the street and request support or phone or be referred by a friend or family member. Another key part of this model that we employ is that we don't have time limits on the support that we provide. So compared to other similar models in the justice system that might have quite a specific time frame, work and pressures to do that work, we are able to work much more extensively over longer periods of time, and which is really important given that often people may not engage initially. There's an opportunity to build rapport, and that maybe sometimes it takes a couple of goes at referral before we can successfully engage in work with people over the long term. So the range of services we have on site, although this is not every service within the city of Yarra or more broadly, but by and large, it's the majority of services that are most commonly support needs for people attending the centre. So as you can see here, we have support for family violence services, I should say. So both for victims of family violence from Berry Street and also for men that are perpetrating violence. So we have a men's referral worker on the team. We have housing support from Launch Housing. We have support for victims of crime. We have support for people who are newly arrived in Australia. We have clinical and non-clinical community outreach, mental health support, financial counsellors, drug and alcohol clinicians, caseworkers from CoHealth. So quite a broad representation there of services and really kind of reflecting the needs of the clients that come into our centre to try to link them with support. So some of the benefits of this model by co-locating all these services within the one building. So like the video kind of referenced this one-stop shop concept. So we have much more streamlined access to all those range of supports. So a referral in this instance to one person on the team is essentially a referral to all the services that sit on site. So we have a really easy access point. So compared to in the community where someone may want to seek mental health support, housing support, and drug and alcohol support, for instance, they may have to attend 3 separate services in separate locations and potentially have to undergo a separate referral process for each of those individual services and tell their story over and over again. So we've really streamlined that process here where we have a one sort of central intake point. So that person can then go and engage with other services as necessary. And I guess also part of this model is looking at identifying other support needs that people might have and being able to make longer term referrals to community-based supports for ongoing assistance. So also you can sort of see part of this approach here of co-locating all this wealth of knowledge and resources is capacity for information sharing is much easier. So if we need to seek a secondary consult or if we need to make a referral, that can just be a matter of going to tap a colleague on the shoulder at the next desk to get expert advice, whether that's about acute mental health presentation, to get advice and potentially make a referral is much simpler. And we're not contending with long wait lists and referrals being sent to external services and not knowing if they've been followed up. So part of this process also is around, and hopefully the case study that we've got will illustrate the capacity that we have for shared case management and care coordination. So it's often the case that one person will be engaged with multiple services on site, and we have an opportunity there to all work collaboratively with the client to address their needs and work towards outcomes. Another key part of this model, having all this range of external services based here on site, is not only do they bring their wealth of knowledge and expertise for their discipline, but they're also able to act as an intake point for their home agency. So they can link clients with ongoing support with the broad range of supports that their agency may have on offer. So you can get a sense there from the client services team of the structure and some of the benefits that we have of this approach. So what I might do now is hand you over to Mathew to talk you through our case study. So he'll introduce you to Peter, who's the subject of our case study.
Thank you, Scott. As we move on to the next slide, we're going to introduce you to someone that Scott and I had been working with for some time. His name is Peter. So Peter was a single unemployed gentleman who was initially referred to myself by the magistrate at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre following some recent offending. I guess there were a couple of unusual aspects to Peter's case when he first presented. He presented as a 50-year-old man on a DSP with criminal offences for the first time. So that's rather unusual for a 50-year-old to have his first offending behaviour and to be appearing before court. I guess the other aspect to Peter's case was the degree of charges and the degree of offending. They were actually quite serious offences that Peter had been charged with. So they range from weapons offences, assaults, drug-related offences, and also property damage. So we're talking someone who had kind of moved quite quickly up the spectrum of offending to have quite serious matters. So initially he was referred for an assessment, and really the assessment process is an opportunity for myself and Scott, when he was brought on board, to really understand Peter's narrative. What is his story? This then allows us to make recommendations, not just to him, but then also to support Peter when he came back to the court. And this became really important as this process goes on, and we'll touch on it a little bit more. So his matter was adjourned, so it was just delayed, and this gave us an opportunity to start to engage with Peter. So I think you can start to see on the next page, my assessment started out early in bringing up a range of different things. So clearly Peter is someone who presented with multiple and complex needs, and early on it became quite apparent what they were. I think one of the big ones that came up fairly soon was this idea that Peter was suffering from some form of cognitive impairment. So Peter, when he first came along, he had very poor short-term memory. He had really significant difficulties recalling just names, addresses, or simple instructions that were given to him. He was prone to kind of outbursts of anger and losing his temper, so he had poor control of his emotions. He really found it difficult to complete anything once he started, and this became a key factor why Scott and I adopted some of the processes that we did. He was quite easily distracted. He had difficulty making these decisions, and he was highly impulsive. So it started to form a picture in my mind that there's something perhaps more behind this presentation. I guess coupled with that was the main reason that he came to me was his substance use. So Peter had a very long history of 20 plus years of significant alcohol consumption. And so significant being up to 30 to 40 drinks per day over a 20-odd year period. This was also coupled with daily cannabis use. And those were the two main presenting drugs that he was talking about at the time. I guess complicating not just his alcohol use and the potential for some form of cognitive impairment was the fact that he was recently evicted from his housing. So Peter had been in private rental, but was unable to sustain that. So he had moved from staying with friends, family, and share houses to being in crisis accommodation. And this became a really important point for Peter, was to find a sense of stability in his life, which he had lost. And recently he was spending most of his time either with share houses or friends, or was couch surfing. So there were some significant kind of barriers to that. I think some of the other important things that came up early also was not just his cognitive impairment and his drug use and his accommodation, but was also other concerns with dental issues, financial concerns, and just his poor physical health status. And these all coupled together to really create a really complex picture of what was happening for Peter at the time. And I think that then started a path where Scott then became involved. So I made an internal referral to Scott just to kind of help sort out what some of these issues were really about. But it also led to multiple referrals that started and were occurring. So I think early on, the interventions that Scott and I put on board were some of the things that Scott spoke about early on about what are the advantages of the embedded specialist service model. So this is that shared case management. And really that was around sharing responsibility for his recovery. With the complexity of his presentation, it makes sense a lot of the time to kind of share that and to be able to have multiple people engaged. And this way you're not overwhelming one person, but you can share the tasks around. I think because of Peter's poor physical health status, his poor memory, we also really adopted an outreach model where we would visit him wherever he was. And this varied a lot. You know, he would be at a friend's place one time, in a share house another time, or he was in crisis housing. So we kind of had to really be quite flexible with that. We did a lot of contact via phones, which was the other main one. We didn't ask Peter to come into the centre too often, simply because it was just such a difficult task getting him to remember the appointments and getting him there on time, even with constant phone reminders and constant text messaging. I guess we did a lot of ongoing monitoring and assessment. So every time we did see Peter, it was another opportunity for us to test our assumptions about how he was going and what his needs were. And this was really what it was all about. As you can see there, one of the puzzles was we really became almost like a calendar and a memory aid for him. So we took on a responsibility to make sure that when appointments were due or when they came up, that we were able to support him to get there. And quite often that's what we did. We would actually take him to appointments. And that was a really key thing, because we also, in supporting him, needed to know what was the outcome of a lot of these appointments. And he was very poor at relaying that information on. So we often would go into the appointments and we were then able to take notes and understand what it is that he needed out of each of those appointments. And whatever that might be, whether it was following up with another doctor, following up with another agency, it just gave us greater certainty about what to do. We did engage a lot of secondary consultation with specialist services, and a lot of them were on-site and internal services. And the other major part is that we started to provide reports back to the court. So throughout Peter's journey, he went back to court on numerous occasions. And on each occasion, we provided a report back to the court around what his needs were and what was being done to address his needs. Because that helps the court understand the individual and not just see that person as a charge sheet, which really is all the court kind of has a perspective of. So it starts to add a human element to him. And that way, when the court does make a decision about his final sentencing, they can kind of do that in an informed way. So we did all that. We had some interventions in place. We then started to make a few referrals. So I think some of the key ones that came up early on was because of his cognitive issues, we arranged a neuropsychological assessment, and that was the key. And so we accompanied to those appointments, helped him get there, and then basically waited with him up until that assessment had been completed. We got him in to start seeing his GP on a regular basis, and that became really important just for his compliance with his medication and just to follow up health issues. He was engaged with a dental clinic, and that became a kind of key feature as well, simply because it became, I think, part of his substance use had been dealing with the pain of his chronic and poor dental hygiene. So that helped to alleviate some of that. He had some significant financial issues, so we engaged him with our financial counsellors at the NJC. He was engaged with Scott, and we also had a formal acute mental health assessment done through our mental health worker. He stayed engaged with myself, and he was engaged with our housing worker. So there was a range of both services on site that we engaged immediately, and then there were external services that we engaged with as well. And that allowed us to start to address his needs and to address the significant kind of dysfunction that he was presenting with in his life. And that was really the start of a process and really a chain of events that occurred that really gave us the ability then to start to make some more definite responses and definite plans for his future. So we did all these initial referrals, and I think what came out of that was the most significant aspect early on was that Peter's cognitive issues really ended up becoming one of the most significant features and the most salient feature early on for him. So we had a neuropsych assessment, and out of that, it kind of recommended an urgent assessment with a neurologist. So we assisted him to do that. So we assisted him to go to his GP, and we assisted to get a neurologist referral, and we made appointments and we attended those appointments. Conversely with that, we then started following on from some other referral pathways as well. So it wasn't just a neurology referral that we made. We started exploring his other aspects that he might need. So we then started to look at getting him an aged care assessment. From there, we also determined that an NDIS assessment and referral was appropriate. So we put in an application for that. We started to explore kind of housing options as well. And one of those was a residential aged care facility. And that really ties in with the aged care assessment. And also and we also then made referrals to Alzheimer's Australia. So I think a lot of our thinking at this stage had been around how we get a better understanding of what is Peter's deficits, but what are his strengths? So what is his cognitive strengths, but more importantly, what are the deficits there that he will have potentially? And this became one of the defining features as we moved forward. And it really became the central pathway. And Scott will kind of come to that now when we really start to talk around what were the outcomes for Peter. And I should probably preface it, and Scott will just reiterate it, but this whole process of Peter's engagement with us at the centre was over a 2-year period. So this, while it looks really nice on paper, it was actually a really lengthy process to get him engaged, to get all the appointments, to do all the follow-up scans that were required. So, but we finally got to a point where we started to see some outcomes, and we started to see some of the things that were addressing Peter's needs. I'm going to hand back to Scott just to kind of talk in more detail about what actually happened, what were the outcomes for Peter, and what did we get done. So Scott, I'm going to just hand it back to you just to take it from there.
So as you can see at the end of our story here, we're coming towards some outcomes for Peter. So as Mathew said, this was a process of about 2 years that we were working quite intensively with Peter. So over that time, we were able to work with him to achieve a number of very significant outcomes. So firstly, a diagnosis. So following this process of doing a neuropsychological assessment and then going to see a neurologist, having a number of appointments, attending a whole range of follow-up scans and tests. So the neurologist arrived at a diagnosis of dementia for Peter, which was quite significant for a man in his early 50s. And so pretty significant for Peter on a whole range of levels. So really this informed our treatment and care and supports moving forward. It was really an instrumental piece here of the puzzle for everybody involved. So this really led us down the path of looking at aged care supports and aged care services. So we were able to support Peter to navigate the aged care sector through getting an aged care assessment and then being successful in getting a home and a residential aged care package. And then to look at some residential aged care facilities. So a number of services declined referral originally, and that was on the basis of Peter's age, concerns that they had about their staff being able to manage a younger man if he was potentially to become aggressive in relation to his dementia, and also the concerns that they would have in terms of his appropriateness for age, being at least 20 years younger than all the other residents in most facilities. So definitely some challenges that we had there, and also I guess navigating the aged care sector in general was quite new for us. It's not something that we would typically do. So a lot of learning along the way, and we were eventually successful in supporting Peter to get a placement with a permanent residential aged care facility. So this was really significant. And not only did this provide accommodation for Peter, so for the first time in many years, he had permanent stable housing that was safe and secure. But he also had attached to that, he had 24-hour, round-the-clock, 7-day-a-week care on site through the nursing staff. He had opportunity to engage with other residents, and so some opportunity there for social contact. And I guess he was able to have a whole flow on from that placement into residential aged care. So that meant access to 3 meals a day provided to him to improve his nutrition, which was really poor prior to this point. He had an ability to have his access to his medications and for those to be supervised in case he forgot to take medication, for instance. And if he needed any follow-up support for his physical or mental health, then they were able to follow that through quite promptly and engage him with other necessary supports. So in addition to that, we were able to refer him for an NDIS package. Once again, this was a case of Peter initially being rejected, his application, on the basis that he didn't demonstrate any needs or support needs attached to impairment that he might demonstrate. So we had a different opinion, and we were able to support him to appeal that decision. And he was later successful in gaining an NDIS package to complement the supports that were provided to him by the residential aged care facility. And the other sort of major big outcome for Peter was his court matters being resolved. So following this lengthy process of his court matter being adjourned on a consistent basis, an opportunity to get a greater sense of what his support needs were. And throughout this process, as Mathew's kind of spoken to already, we were able to provide updates to the court, written and verbal updates to the court about his progress. So this led us towards the end point of his involvement with the court, where we were able to advise of his diagnosis and then provide some recommendations for treatment and support for him. And this was all taken into consideration when it came to sentencing. So Peter was given a non-custodial sentence, so an adjourned undertaking, a sentence that he could serve in the community with conditions to remain engaged with supports and the treatment plan and being put in place and not commit further offending. So to the best of our knowledge, this is a period that's probably about 3 years since we've stopped working with Peter, give or take. And to the best of our knowledge, that he's continued to remain well engaged with the supports that have been set up for him and not commit further offending. So some other significant outcomes that you can see here on your screen. So he had a number of debts that were waived. So up until this point, he had debt collectors phoning him on pretty much a daily basis, and it's something that was very stressful for him and something he really didn't know how to manage. And through referral to our financial counsellors at NJC, they supported a special circumstances application to the court, and his debts were waived. So significant stress alleviated there for Peter. Some flow-on outcomes were around obtaining a will. So this was able to be done for free through one of the clinics that was set up at NJC, and was important for Peter in the context of his recent diagnosis around dementia. Very significant around his substance use was that he ceased alcohol altogether. So part of this was around receiving a diagnosis of dementia and the neurologist advising him that his diagnosis was secondary to long-term alcohol abuse, and that any further drinking would only accelerate further cognitive decline for him. So that was really enough for him to decide that he wanted to stop alcohol. And really that sort of tied in with another issue that Mathew referenced earlier around his dental issues that he had. So quite significant pain that he was experiencing from essentially decaying teeth and abscesses that were causing a lot of pain for him, and drinking alcohol was one way to try to self-medicate and manage some of that pain. So when we were able to address that issue for him around engaging with a dental clinic, having a number of extractions and working towards getting fitted for dentures, that also kind of alleviated some of that main driver around his alcohol use. So that sort of combined with other factors for him to cease alcohol. He did continue some cannabis use, but the lesser of two evils in this context, we think. So you can also see a range of other underlying stresses that have been alleviated. So his physical health also improving with access to 3 nutritious meals provided per day. He was able to gain weight and have access to his medications on a regular basis. So all of these stresses being alleviated for him also contributed to his mental health improving quite significantly. So for a gentleman that we saw at times that was quite agoraphobic and had periods where he didn't want to get out of bed or leave his house and had high levels of anxiety and was just quite overwhelmed by all the stress in his life. So this was quite significant in terms of he's got housing, he's got some kind of diagnosis, and we were able to provide context for his offending to the court. His link with supports, he's had a number of kind of pressures around his finances alleviated, and his physical health has improved. So all these kind of things in combination working towards improved general sense of health and well-being. So that's kind of at the crux of this is, I guess, our approach of looking at supporting people to address their mental health and well-being. And often these are real drivers in terms of underlying factors for offending. And you can see the outcomes in this instance are for Peter, and I guess also looking at what this means for his engagement with other entities, and in this instance it being the court, and how those things have influenced each other in this case. So there we go, the story of Peter with some significant outcomes over a long period of time. So hopefully we can get to our last slide here. And my computer's frozen again. It likes to do it around this time. There we go. So hopefully you get a sense there of the opportunity that courts can have there in linking people with treatment and support, or being that conduit. So that's really essential, I think. We hope you take away, and something that we're really trying to impress is really that contact with the justice system can often be a really unique opportunity to provide access to treatment and support for people that wouldn't typically seek it through conventional channels. So we think that's really important in this instance, and really focusing on that therapeutic role of courts as opposed to being strictly punitive. So as we mentioned, really our community justice approach and what we're showing here at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre, focusing on improving health and wellbeing and the flow-on effect that has in then potentially reducing the risk of reoffending and creating a safer community more broadly. And hopefully that gives you a sense as well of the importance, and we think really essential in this instance, working with people with multiple and complex needs is collaboration. So there you have it, folks. We've got a couple of references here, bit of shameless self-promotion for Mathew and myself at the top. But if you are interested, and I understand that Alicia is going to send an email around shortly with links to some of these. So if you're interested in doing some further reading about evaluations of the Neighbourhood Justice Centre around outcomes and also around costs, the Ross article and the Morgan and Brown would be fantastic. Further reading. They're both published in the Australian Institute of Criminology Journal.
So thank you for attending, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.